The October light was beginning to fade as the U.S. Army limousine sped along the Autobahn in the American zone of occupied Germany. Inside rode the Supreme Commander of the Allied armies in Europe, General of the Army Dwight D. Eisenhower, accompanied by his son, Lieutenant John S. D. Eisenhower. The trip was not unusual. Occupation duty in the autumn of 1945 allowed ample time for the Supreme Commander to see his son, who was stationed nearby. Yet later, John would remember his father's mood that evening as uncharacteristically pensive, a heavy silence filling the cavernous space of the Cadillac. The manicured fields and ruined towns of a defeated nation slid past the windows, a landscape of profound and unsettling quiet after years of cataclysmic noise. Finally, as the car hummed along the stretch of road between Bad Homburg and Frankfurt, Eisenhower turned to John, his gaze fixed on some distant point, and said with a tone of deep regret, "I had to relieve General Patton from the Third Army today." The words hung in the air, freighted with the weight of a 30-year friendship, a shared crucible of war, and the end of one of the most storied military careers in American history. To relieve George S. Patton Jr. was not merely an administrative change of command. It was the silencing of a volcano, the grounding of a thunderbolt. It was an act that Eisenhower, the master of coalition warfare and political compromise, had desperately sought to avoid. But the warrior who had been the perfect instrument for total war had proven to be the utterly wrong man for a deeply complicated and fragile peace. The tragedy of Patton's last command was not one of defeat on the battlefield, but of an utter inability to comprehend a world where the fighting had stopped. To understand the decision that so troubled Eisenhower, one must return to the intoxicating days of early May 1945. Victory in Europe. The 1,000-year Reich had collapsed into ash and ignominy. For General George S. Patton, it was the culmination of a life's ambition. His beloved Third Army had slashed its way across France, relieved Bastogne, crossed the Rhine, and plunged deep into the heart of Germany, covering more ground and capturing more enemy soldiers than any other army in the theater. He was an American Caesar, a figure of mythic proportions, his pearl-handled revolvers and profane speeches as much a part of his legend as his tactical genius. In the first week of May, as his forces liberated the western part of Czechoslovakia and linked up with the Soviets, Patton stood at the absolute zenith of his power and fame. He was, by his own estimation and that of many others, America's greatest fighting general. But the end of hostilities presented Patton with a challenge for which his entire being was unsuited: stillness. The qualities that made him a peerless army commander, his relentless aggression, his single-minded focus on destruction of the enemy, his contempt for politics, and his impulsive, often outrageous pronouncements, were now profound liabilities. The United States was not just a conqueror, it was an occupier, tasked with the monumental challenge of governing a shattered nation of 70 million people. The new enemy was not a panzer division on the horizon, but chaos itself: starvation, disease, economic collapse, and the insidious legacy of 12 years of Nazism. The blueprint for this occupation was a document known as the Joint Chiefs of Staff Directive 1067, or JCS 1067. It was the legal and philosophical bedrock of American policy in Germany, and it was a document born of righteous fury. Drafted primarily within the Treasury Department under Henry Morgenthau Jr., it was designed to be punitive, not benevolent. Its primary objective was to ensure Germany could never again wage war. It called for a hard peace, explicitly stating, "Germany will not be occupied for the purpose of liberation, but as a defeated enemy nation." The directive mandated the complete dismantling of Germany's war-making industrial capacity, the strict rationing of its economy to a level no higher than its neighbors, and most critically, a sweeping and uncompromising program of denazification. Denazification was the moral crusade at the heart of the occupation. It was not merely about arresting war criminals. It was a systematic effort to purge every vestige of Nazi ideology and influence from German public life. The policy required the removal of any individual who had been more than a nominal member of the Nazi Party from any position of influence, whether in government, industry, the judicial system, or even public utilities. From provincial governors down to local postmasters and waterworks supervisors, a political questionnaire, the Fragebogen, would determine their fate. In theory, it was a clean sweep, a moral purification. In practice, it was a bureaucratic nightmare. The Nazi Party had been a sprawling, octopus-like organization, its tentacles reaching into every corner of German society. To remove every active member would mean gutting the very administrative structures needed to keep the country from collapsing entirely. Into this political and administrative minefield strode General Patton. In the initial chaotic weeks, his Third Army was responsible for a vast swath of southern Germany, and soon he was appointed the Military Governor of Bavaria, the largest and most important state in the American zone. From his headquarters in Munich, the very birthplace of the Nazi movement, Patton was now expected to trade his tank commander's helmet for a bureaucrat's hat. It was a role he despised. He saw himself as a warrior, not a mayor. He complained bitterly in his diary that he was being forced to act as a proconsul, bogged down in the minutiae of sewage systems, food distribution, and displaced persons. The most immediate and overwhelming problem was the human tide of displaced persons, or DPs. Millions of them swarmed the roads of Germany. Liberated slave laborers, concentration camp survivors, political prisoners, and ethnic Germans expelled from Eastern Europe. They were starving, sick, and traumatized. Patton, who had personally witnessed the unspeakable horrors of the Buchenwald and Ohrdruf concentration camps and had famously forced the German civilians of nearby towns to tour them, held a deep and visceral hatred for the Nazi regime. Yet his sympathy for its victims was often selective and tragically compromised by his own prejudices. He viewed the DPs, particularly the Jewish survivors who were gathered in wretched collection camps, as a disciplinary problem. He wrote in his diary that they were lower than animals, lost to all decency, and complained that the camps were unsanitary, failing to grasp that the starving, traumatized inmates were in no condition to maintain them. This stunning lack of empathy was a symptom of his larger political blindness. Patton's worldview was brutally simple, forged in a lifetime of military tradition and aristocratic certainty. He saw the world as a battleground between forces of order and forces of chaos, of civilization against barbarism. For him, the true enemy had never been just the Nazis, but the broader threat of totalitarianism, and in his mind, the Red Army of the Soviet Union was now the single greatest threat to Western civilization. As early as the day after Germany's surrender, he was writing to his wife that the Soviets were a scurvy race and simply savages, and that the Allies had disarmed the wrong people. This conviction became the guiding principle of his disastrous tenure as military governor. He believed that the harsh policies of JCS 1067 were madness. To dismantle German industry and purge its bureaucracy was, in his view, to deliberately weaken the very bulwark that Europe would need to resist the coming communist tide. He saw the German people not as a defeated enemy to be punished, but as a future ally to be cultivated. His solution was pragmatic, simple, and politically catastrophic. To get Bavaria back on its feet, he would use the men who knew how to run it, regardless of their political past. He therefore slow-rolled the Denazification process into near immobility. When faced with the directive to remove all former Nazis from civil administration, he balked. Finding a competent German official in Bavaria who had not been a member of the party was, he argued, like trying to find a needle in a haystack. He believed he could distinguish between ardent, ideologically committed Nazis and those who had simply joined the party to keep their jobs, the so-called technical Nazis. He kept in place figures like Karl Fiehler, the ardently Nazi Lord Mayor of Munich, for weeks after the occupation began, simply because he was effective. To Patton, a functioning power grid was more important than a mayor's political purity. To Washington and to Eisenhower's supreme headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force, SHAEF, this was tantamount to heresy. It directly contravened the central moral and political objective of the entire occupation. Word of Patton's actions quickly began to filter up the chain of command. Scathing reports from journalists and special investigators landed on Eisenhower's desk. They detailed how, in Patton's Bavaria, former Nazi officials were being reappointed to positions of authority, how the hunt for war criminals was being pursued with a lack of vigor, and how the general himself was making dangerously indiscreet comments about the Soviets and the foolishness of American policy. Eisenhower, who revered Patton as a fighter but was acutely aware of his political liabilities, found himself in an agonizing position. He dispatched envoys and wrote letters, gently at first, then more firmly, urging his old friend to adhere to the policy. He tried to explain the political realities, the pressure from Moscow, the press, and Washington. But Patton would not, or could not, listen. He saw Eisenhower's cautions not as the prudent advice of a superior, but as the weak-willed capitulations of a politician who had lost his nerve. The stage was being set for a final, tragic confrontation, not on a battlefield, but in the unforgiving glare of a press conference.